Jesus, no eye in the sky. Moonshine Jesus, baby, alright. Moonshine Jesus, a surprising delight. Moonshine Jesus, won't you shine a light?
Hello and welcome to the Moonshine Jesus Show. We are glad that you're with us today. ProgressiveChristianity.org sponsors Moonshine Jesus Show and hope that you will go and check out all of the wonderful progressive Christian resources there and that you'll follow us on social media. I'm here today with my good friend Mark. How you doing today, Mark?
Howdy, howdy. Glad to be here, man. Excited.
Yes, excited to talk about the Sandman. But here's an important thing to know. If you haven't seen it, you're going to get some spoilers along the way. We like to call ourselves a spoiler-full zone. So I think that for us to really delve in, we kind of spoil some things. But I hope you'll hang out and have a fun time with us. And one of the things that we do is we start off by having a themed cocktail. And Mark, I can't wait to hear what your themed cocktail is for Sandman.
You know, I'm actually more excited about yours. Mine is actually simply called the Sandman. I think probably because it looks a little bit like sand in a glass.
Yeah.
It's 1 part vodka, 1 part lime juice, 1 part pineapple juice, half a part triple sec, and then just as you shake that up over and pour it over ice, and then you top it with a little Coca-Cola, which gives it that brownish haze of kind of a sandy look. Rather than being mixed, it floats in up between it. So I'm having a Sandman. What are you having?
That looks really good. I like that. It is very sandy in quality. So I am having something that I'm calling the Sweet Dreams. Sweet Dreams.
Oh, I like this.
And it's pretty decadent, I've got to admit. So,
oh my gosh. I'm jealous already, and I don't even know what's in it.
It looks pretty. I know, right?
It
looks very decadent. Okay, so it's an adult hot chocolate, basically. So the mix looks like sand, and it looks like sand kind of here with different layers.
Sure does.
And so it's got ice cream. It's got a shot of peppermint schnapps, a shot of Kahlua with hot chocolate poured over it, and it is topped with whipped cream and sprinkles and chocolate chips.
It looks like an incredible dream. I will probably be dreaming of it tonight. Frankly, I think I will.
I'm going to be going to sleep with a stomach ache. So we'll say cheers.
Well, here's to both of us. With you going to bed with a stomach ache, you can have the nightmares, and I'll have the sweet dreams, wishing I had yours.
Oh, okay. I like
cheers.
That. Cheers.
That's pretty good.
Is yours good?
Yeah, it could go into the rotation. I'm not even going to. I know how good yours has to be. That sounds so delicious.
It is very sweet, very chocolatey. Wonderful.
Lovely.
Okay, hey, let's get into it.
All right.
Moonshine Jesus. Moonshine Jesus. Moonshine Jesus. Moonshine Jesus, won't you shine a light?
Hello and welcome back to the Moonshine Jesus Show. We're really glad you're with us. Today we're going to be talking about Netflix adaptation of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman comic, one of the best comics ever written. And just to keep people up to date and catch you up to what's going on in The Sandman, Morpheus, aka Dream of the Endless, aka Master of Dreams, aka Prince of Stories, aka Cockatoo, aka the same. Okay. There's more, but I won't impress those on you. Anyway, he's imprisoned by a man who's trying to bring his son back to life, and then a century later, Morpheus, the Sandman, frees himself, but finds that he's basically weakened, and his kingdom is rapidly falling apart, and nightmares are actually roaming the earth now. And he goes on this quest to regain the tools of his trade in order to rebuild his kingdom, and he ends up facing off with a whole host of enemies, including some of his siblings who personify different parts of human condition. And the show, it moves through different time periods, different worlds, different genres, and then ultimately addresses the concepts of horror, humanity, and hope. So, Caleb, how familiar were you with the source material before you started watching the show? And then what did you think as you were watching, man?
Yeah, so I knew absolutely nothing about the
Right, fair
Sandman.
enough.
I knew no, so I was like, an average viewer coming in and watching this for the very first time, and at first I wasn't quite sure what to make of the show. I watched a couple of episodes and I'm like, do I like this or not?
Mm,
What is going on here? And as I went on, I'm like, oh, this is asking some really deep questions.
right.
And the other thing that really caught me off guard, Mark, was a
Mhm.
lot of shows you really get kind of a pretty consistent feel. It's the same characters in every episode, and we've got the main characters in the Sandman, but
Yeah.
sometimes they're not really in the episode. There are,
Right.
2 or 3 episodes that they're not really in, and so that
Mhm.
kind of caught me off guard a little bit. And then I thought, well, I think though I really like this. It's you never quite know what to expect with each episode. But I know that you were much more familiar with the source material than I
Yeah.
was. And so what was
Yeah.
this like for you?
Well, both because of who wrote it and because it's called The
Yeah.
Sandman. And growing up, that became a nickname of mine with the last name Sandlin.
Mm,
I was just floored. This has been something that readers have been wanting to see happen, and there have been lots
mhm.
of talk of movies,
Yeah.
and there's been like a radio show made out of it that was reasonably good. But when I heard that Neil Gaiman was going to be involved in this, I had really
Mhm.
high hopes, and he is heavily involved. And for me, the experience was, I read it when it first came out, and a little bit younger, and it seemed it seemed alive. It seemed to come off the
Mm.
page, and this felt very much like it was a long time ago that I read it, so I don't have perfect memory of it. But I tell you, even down to the dialogue, it felt like a comic book that I had already read that I knew reasonably well coming to life. It felt so real and so authentic and so true to the original sources. I was a giddy kid again, man. I can't tell you
Mm.
how happy I was. And then a person who considers himself, a theologian, as somewhat of a
Uh-huh.
philosopher, like you were pointing out, the themes of this and the questions that were being asked implicitly and sometimes not so much were just, it just I can't, it's hard. You can tell by the times I'm
Yeah.
stuttering trying to figure out what to say. It excited me so much, and it's one of my favorite shows in a very long time.
Yeah. I can see that because there's for those of us who are interested in theology and even things like Greco-Roman mythology,
Mythology,
it's
right?
yeah, it's so rich,
Rich. Mm.
and if you've studied that stuff, it's like, yes, I love to see this explored, and I love to see these characters in a modern context because that's not something we get to see terribly often, and so that was kind of fun. So
It really
I
was.
appreciated that as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to get to a little bit more of the show, but I want to have a couple of shout outs of people who are watching us
Yeah.
live. First of all, Thor Olson makes a great point. With our drinks here, we have the Sandman versus the Sweet Dreams. I kind of like that. Kind of
Mhm.
like that.
Yes.
And also a shout out to a new listener or watcher, Dwight Lee Wolter, who is already loving the show. We're glad you're here with us, Dwight. And hopefully you've seen The Sandman, because it's not a spoiler-free zone. But it is more than worth hearing what we have to say, even if you've not watched it, and going back and filling in a little bit. So one of the main parts, Caleb, of this story is the change from episode 1 to the last
Yeah.
episode that we see in Morpheus.
Mhm.
I'm curious what you believe is the arc of his character, where he moves and changes from sort of this arrogant, heavy-handed, somewhat indifferent ruler to a much more sort of compassionate one. What did you see uh, in this storyline that impacted him in such a way that he moves those great differences. That's a large change, and well, in terms of years, it's 100 years, but
right.
still, in terms of story, it was just a few episodes. What did you see that kind of pushed that?
Yeah, and they did do a really good job of helping us to really go on the journey with the character and to see what was happening so that we could see some change. It didn't really feel rushed. And I think that's one of the primary questions of this show in general is, can people change, and what causes change both personally and systemically? And I thought that was really interesting to explore.
Absolutely.
And that somehow dreams are an important part of that, and enough people sharing a common dream as a part of seeing change. And I thought that was a really interesting way to bring the king of dreams into the modern world and to make it applicable to societal change. So I think one of the things, though, in Morpheus specifically that caused him to change was a focus on personal relationships and on seeing human beings as more than just objects or things. And I think the line of dialogue that we heard a lot is like, are human beings here to serve us, or are we here to serve them, as the endless? And I think a recognition that it's kind of a both and I think that's a pretty good thing for life too, right? That whenever we have this kind of dichotomy about love of neighbor and love of self, and maybe it's not so dichotomous, but it's like a back and forth, and it's a full. So I think that was. What do you think?
I think, I love your point. One of my favorite, and kind of goes back to where I was going to go with this, goes back to a line in an amazing episode called The Sound of Her Wings, where Death, Sandman, Morpheus's sibling, is slowly helping people pass from our world to their world. And she has this amazing, like, talking about they're not here to serve us. We're not there. She says, I'm holding their hand and they're holding mine. I'm not alone when I'm doing this job. And I thought this was a beautiful way of recognizing that, we think of death as being this lonely thing. And then we also have to think about how we all sometimes don't realize how reciprocating relationships are, that even in this way of telling the story, that death's self ends up recognizing that this is a mutual relationship, that I'm holding their hand, they're holding my hand, we're doing this together. It was sort of a beautiful moment there. And I really do think that episode where he follows along with his sibling Death to watch these folks passing, I really feel like that was the changing moment where the relationship, as you pointed out, really started changing the way he understood who he was and what his relationship with humanity actually should be, and what was a good, healthy way of doing that.
I loved that episode in particular. That was my favorite episode of all of them. And you and I were chatting just briefly ahead of time. We said, hey, there are two standout episodes here. One is 24/7, and it's, kind of horrifying. And then it's followed by this one, The Sound of Her Wings, that's about death. And so I thought it was beautiful that they put those two together, because one is kind of horrifying and one is beautiful. And so you get them back to back. But the thing I loved about The Sound of Her Wings was that Morpheus goes with his sister Death, as she's doing this, and as she's bringing people to the afterlife, letting them go from this life to the next. But then the second half of the episode explores his relationship over several hundred years with this guy who's opted not to die. They strike an agreement, and he doesn't die. And every 100 years they meet in the same tavern, and he says, "You still want to live." And every year, every 100 years, he has to make that decision. I thought that was kind of powerful to explore.
I thought it was too, and it's one of the rare times in the retelling that each episode doesn't represent a comic. This is actually two comics. That change, that shift from Death to Hob, I think is his name, where he says Morpheus basically says, I don't think that he'd really want to live when he's lived a long time. But every 100 years, he keeps going, no, I want to keep doing this. I want to keep doing this. And I thought it was sort of brilliant to mix those two together, of this person who wants to keep living, and then these stories of folks who are actually passing, but are passing it in somewhat of a peaceful way, because of how I love this version of death, that death is there to comfort and not as this menacing, dark hooded, indifferent kind of being. I love that. There is something in that story I'm really curious about your take on.
Mm-hmm.
I think two of the most striking deaths that death helps move into the next realm come with the old gentleman who's a violinist who wants to play Schubert's unfinished composition as his last act.
Mm-hmm.
I found it really interesting to juxtapose that with the other more striking, which was a child in its crib who was taken. It was so interesting because the gentleman, the violinist, clearly not so much. He was well up in his age. I don't know that his song was unfinished so much, but they have him play this unfinished concerto composition from Schubert, and then they have this child whose song really was just starting. I just thought it was sort of beautiful, and I'm curious if you have a thought of why they chose to put the unfinished music, the concerto, the composition into his hands when his story was kind of like it was the last note of his aria kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Bella Chernoff Versace also reminds us that he recited the Shema, and that was a very powerful scene too. I appreciated that. I think, and that scene was striking and kind of hard. And I've got like a 1-year-old, and so seeing the baby in the crib, like it makes you really appreciate life, I think. And one of the things that I appreciated about that is they talked about death as a gift and how human beings don't often see it as a gift. And I think that one of the things that we often realize as life goes on is how short life actually is and how little time we actually have. But it takes years and wisdom to actually recognize that. And so I think the Unfinished Symphony is pointing to that sometimes no matter how much time you have, it doesn't feel like enough, or there's a hope that there's something, there's some part that can help reach completion. And as we're younger, perhaps that we don't realize that in the same way. So I don't know. What do you think?
No, I agree. Kind of to play off of that and maybe expand a little bit. As you said that death talked about that humans don't see death as a gift. Kind of has this beautiful line that says, humanity is so ready to accept birth, but not death, and unwilling to see them both as a gift. And I actually wonder if it was an intentional juxtaposition to try to be striking, because this old man at some point is, at least on a subconscious level, seems to be feeling like his song is unfinished. He wants to play this unfinished. And this child is taken early. And I wonder how much this is a commentary. I even just said this child's taken early, a commentary on our need to put life on a human timeline and place value on that life in terms of how long it exists rather than the impact it has. I mean, think of the love that child brought into the world with it when it was born. And maybe it's this gentle way of reminding us that there is no unfinished song, that the songs are present and that we can value them for what they are. And maybe we need to learn to distance ourselves from these human-made timelines in terms of how they place value on something. I wonder if that might be part of it.
That's deep, man.
That's what we do here. But listen, we could go on and on this kind of stuff. I do want another quick shout out to a person who is watching live who has a great question. Jim Gleason is asking, is the podcast coming back too? The podcast has already come back. We've had, I think, 30 some episodes. You can download it, Jim, on any of the places you would get your podcast. So please go look for us there. But this segment, it has run its course. We need to move on to our more theological and political segment of the show, which is really kind of the meat of what we're here for. So we're going to hit a quick drop, and we will be back on the other side.
Welcome back to the Moonshine Jesus Show. We're moving into our Theopolitico segment. But before we do, I want to let you know that we also have a website, moonshinejesus.com. And if you go there, you'll find all of our podcasts. And we're going to start putting our drinks on there as well. So if you're ever inspired by anything that that we're drinking and you think, I want to try that, we're going to put our recipes there as well. So check out moonshinejesus.com. So we're moving into the Theopolitico segment, and I found this series to be so rich in theological and political themes.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I have several questions that I want to explore during this segment. But I want to start here. I think the main thesis of this show is something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, and that's that dreams are powerful, and that if enough people share them, that great things can be accomplished. But Morpheus says this. He says, dreams rarely survive in the waking world. Nightmares, on the other hand, seem to thrive there. So I'm curious, Mark, if you think that's true. And also, I'm curious about what you think about the whole notion of the kingdom of God being a dream. So I'm going to throw those two broad things out there. I want to see what you do with it.
All right. Well, for the first one, I would say no. I disagree that nightmares live better in the world than dreams. I think they both exist very readily. I do think it is part of the human condition that we tend to pay more attention to the nightmares. If anything, it might be go back to our last segment a little bit and relate to that we are much more willing to accept birth and much less willing to accept death. And we almost like birth is great. We celebrate, great, it's done. And then we stress the rest of our lives worrying about death. And I think that that's kind of the dream nightmare. If you take birth is the dream and death is the nightmare, which is what we sometimes unfortunately set it up in our heads. And we spend all of this time and energy focused on the thing we fear, rather than the hopeful moments. So no, that first part of the question, I get why he said that, but I think that has more to do with how humans focus on it in the human condition than it has to do with reality and what how the world works. And then it's in terms of heaven being a dream. Well, boy, that's a complicated question, isn't it? Depending on how you understand dream, heaven. If you think of heaven as a real space, then it is a dream, right? It's this perfect place that everyone hopes to get to. If you think of a dream as a place that's not real and that is fictional in some ways, well, it depends on where your theology falls, doesn't it? Since we don't really understand what the afterlife is like. So I'm okay with them putting it in that realm because there's so many loose definitions of both heaven and dream that I can kind of live with it. Yeah. But, I want to push back a little bit on what you say the theme of this is. And it comes back to, I think it's a quote from the last episode where Dream, Morpheus, the Sandman, is talking to the devil. And she says to him, "What power have dreams in hell?" And he goes, "What power would hell have if those in prison were not able to dream of heaven?" I feel like maybe that's pointing to a close to the theme you're talking about, but an interesting philosophical question and even theological question. And it is that there is this intricate and maybe opposite relationship between fear and hope. And I feel like this is a show about they coexist. They're basically opposites. I mean, think about how we think about the future. We either fear the future or we are hopeful about the future. And I kind of feel like this is a story being told from a rather dark space about how hope needs to overcome fear. That is what the real value of life ends up being, is when we can let hope overcome fear. I'm just curious if you see those as opposites, and if that might be part of what was going on in that conversation between the two.
Yeah, as I was listening to the conversation, I thought that one of the things he was pointing to is that, the power of dreaming there was for to kind of create this sense of suffering, even
Mhm.
knowing that there's something better and not being
Right.
able to ever obtain it.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that there's I think the difference between a dream and a nightmare is
Mm.
interesting as we think
Yeah.
about this. I was thinking about in this segment and when he was in hell and elsewhere, as they're talking about dreams and hope and fear. I was thinking about James Cone's book on Martin and Malcolm and America. Have you read that one, Mark? And it's called An American Dream or a Nightmare, right? And
Right.
and it
Mhm.
depends kind of on your experience on
Yes.
on like if America is a
Which is which?
or a nightmare, right? And so depending on your lived experience in America, whether you're experiencing America as a dream or as a
Mhm.
nightmare. And I think maybe this plays into your point about fear and hope, because I think we see that in the United States a lot as we're thinking about the
Right.
future of the United States and our current political situation, right? Like, do you have hope about the future, about who we are
Mhm.
or who we can become? Is that your primary way of responding to things, or is it out of fear that is our primary way of responding to things? And I think we see that play out in American politics. So that's something. I don't think I really answered your question, but I walked
Right.
all the way around
No.
it. And
No,
and
I think it was a very needed nuancing of it, and I really appreciate it very very much. Um, can I ask a question in this
yeah,
segment? I know
ask
you're
a
leading to
follow-up.
say
Yes.
24/7, that episode where they're
Yeah.
in
Yeah, we got to talk about
the
it.
diner. I'm really curious at what your thoughts are. So, for those who haven't
Yeah.
seen it yet, don't mind the spoilers. Essentially, there is someone there who has a crystal that allows him to make a wish, and that wish to come true no matter what. And his wish is that the world become completely truthful. And
Yeah.
what starts happening is everyone in the diner starts becoming blatantly truthful with each other, and ultimately they all end up killing each other. So my question is, do you think a world with no lies actually means a world of destruction? I mean, that's a deep,
Yes.
yeah,
I
right?
mean, I respond instinctively, but I've seen in the comments too, a number of people say 24/7 was super hard to watch. And it was. I was
Yeah,
sitting there, and it breaks the pace of the show because you've been kind of following the same narrative up until that point, and then it breaks, and it's the entire episode is set in this diner, and Morpheus isn't really there until the very end. And so it's different. And I was sitting there watching, this scene unravel as people not only stop, with the social niceties, but become
hmm
100% honest. There's nothing held back, and how
hmm
that devolves. And so I sit there watching it and thinking, oh my gosh, this is hard, but this is an important conversation. This is an important
right,
episode to watch for that reason, because I think that there's something to be said about why we have social conventions and niceties, and how those can be
right.
used to maintain relationships. And I don't
You're
think I've
right.
ever been someone who's been in favor of 100% honesty. I don't think any
But
pastors are
isn't
in
it
favor of
interesting though that
100%
society
honesty.
frequently society, and I think this is an important conversation to
Yeah.
have. Frequently, society will shame a person for not being truthful, and so I
Right.
think it's important to talk about uh, the kinds of truthfulness that are necessary and needed. Those
Hmm.
that maybe we should not necessarily shame someone for, but call them out on when they're not being truthful about things. And then there are things that what we think of as the hard truth isn't the caring truth. It's not,
Right.
there's many dimensions to truth, and you can give the hardcore truth, or you can give a truth that augments it or is a reality off of it. A person struggling with X, and if you tell them that, it could really make a massive issue. Or you could talk about parts of it that are positive, like how they've managed it well and that kind of thing. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on the type, a variance of truths, and which one are there ones that we should always try to be truthful about, and ones that we should be careful about because of a sense of compassion, which the show's definitely also about compassion.
Yeah, so I love Dwight Lee Walther's comment. He's a listener here who says, "Honesty without compassion is cruelty," and
Absolutely.
I think that's right. That whenever we're speaking to other human beings, we have to think about love and compassion and care. And I think that's the message of Jesus. That there are times, yes, when we need to be active in truth telling, especially when it comes to matters of injustice and oppression. Okay, those are things that we need to be 100% honest about. We need to call that out. And even in less formal settings, of course, when we're talking about Congress and legislatively and all that kind of stuff. But I think less formally too, whenever we're doing human to human interactions, right? If we hear people saying things that are racist or things that are blatantly wrong, I think truth telling in those situations is extremely important. But I think when we're talking about our interpersonal relationships, always telling people what you think about every little thing isn't necessarily the most important thing. And it's not always necessarily the truth, right? Just because I think something doesn't necessarily make it true.
I am so glad you said that, because I was about to talk to you about your shirt. So this is great. This is great. This is good news. This is good.
Like my shirt, Mark.
Not completely kidding. Completely kidding. It's actually very cool. Reminds me of the stars in the sky, which reminds me of dreams at night. So I think it's fantastic.
Oh yeah, it's thematic.
That
was my whole point.
That's my edge of the truth I was about to say. So
Okay. Here's something else I want to talk to you about, Mark.
Right.
I want to ask your question on this, and this has to do with Greco-Roman mythology, because we brought this up, and I want to explore it a little deeply.
All right.
And it's this.
You go there. You're going to be more of an expert than I am on this.
I don't think so. You're gonna know that. You're gonna know this. Okay, so
right.
I want to know the series. It's rich with this Greco-Roman mythology, important because that's the mythology that was around whenever Jesus lived and preached, right?
Right.
And so this raised a question for me. So once people believed in a god named Morpheus. They worshipped him, right? Just like the other gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon. Now, most people do not believe in Morpheus. Most people are not worshiping Morpheus or other gods in the pantheon. However, many people have a faith that claim that their truth is the truth, right? The one and only truth. So this is my question. How do we know? How do we know that our truth is the only truth? And should Christianity go the way of Morpheus? I mean, does the Christian God go the way of the other Greco-Roman gods? What do you think about that?
Well, first I'll start with the question of how do we know our God is the only God, or the true God, or the true truth, or that? I think that is a height of hubris to think that somehow you happen to be born into, or be one of the rare folks on the face, if you weren't born into it, could find it and articulate it properly. I think it's a much healthier understanding to recognize that humanity, for most of its existence, has had a sense of something larger than us. Which, again, if there wasn't something, or we didn't believe there was something larger than us, that's also a bit of hubris as well, that we're the best thing the universe freaking has to offer. That's a little scary to think of. And so for me, logically, just purely logically, not emotionally, not theologically, just straight up logically, certainly makes a lot of sense to say everyone's understanding of God is simply their pursuit of this larger thing. It's their concept, their little. I've heard it described as that whatever the divine is this giant pie, and that each of us have figured out a little slice of it and are trying to understand it the best we can based on our slice, and not recognizing all the other people's slices of what that reality is. So I think that is the height of hubris, and you're going to have to remind me of your second part of your question, though.
So my question then is, should the Christian God go the way of Morpheus, or maybe the way Ellen Green said it? Why do we need a God? Why do we need God? Should God, the idea of divinity, go away? What do you think of that?
Well, that's two questions. So my answer to the first one is that what the Christian God has become in America, at least the predominant one, deserves to die. It is mean, it is cruel, it marginalizes, it self-aggrandizes, and it promotes a certain group of folks over others. That is hurtful and harmful and will never better humanity or the world in any way. If that is who God is, no one needs that God, and we should seek to crucify it, period. Do we need a God? Well, of course not. Does that negate the existence of something that's larger than us, that might not be this personified thing that we try to make it? I have the sense, I have the belief, and when I look at religions around the world, that there is something larger than us. If I look at my experience in the world, I see that there's something larger than us, something that connects us, this energy that really seems to push us overall towards the betterment of folks. And I think that's really important. So that concept of, quote, God, I think we do need.
I appreciate that, Mark, and I appreciate the way that even though I threw like 3 or 4 questions out at you at a time, that you broke them up and you just responded to all of them and reminded us of how good theology is done, right? What is it we need versus what is it that is true? And if we're being honest with ourselves, what is true? So I appreciate you doing that, Mark. And I know we could sit here and talk about theology and politics of this all day, because as you and I talked about before this even started, each episode is packed. We could do, an episode of Moonshine Jesus on each episode of The Sandman. But alas, we cannot. And so we must move into our favorite segment of the show, Make Me Look Stupid. So we're going to do a drop. We're going to come back. We're going to try to make each other look stupid.
Welcome back to the Moonshine Jesus Show. You caught me as I'm still trying to finish pouring myself another drink, but I think I just finally finished that off. You are joining us for, as Caleb pointed out, one of our favorite segments. It's called Make Me Look Stupid. This is a segment in which we commence to try to ask a question that our co-host might find challenging. And so, Caleb, I am going to take the honors. Sometimes I try to be benevolent and hand them off to you, but I am going to take the honors on this one. And it takes a tiny bit of setup. So we've both talked about that probably the 2 standout episodes for us were 24/7 in the diner and then The Sound of Her Wings about death.
Right.
In 24/7, I would argue that at the core, and how brilliant it was to put those back to back. I think that there was a lot that happened, and it was kind of the turning point in the story, as well as for Morpheus, right? So I would argue at the core of 24/7 is the story of horror, self-interest, and desire. And then it gets juxtaposed with The Sound of Her Wings, which is about hope and kindness and compassion. My question is that the story of life? The 2 juxtaposed against ech other?
Perhaps so. I especially liked the thought that death was the sign of hope, which is not the message, and compassion. That's not the narrative about death we have in our society. And so that was really interesting to sit with. But yeah, I think the message that life can be filled with horror and greed and self-service, and the way that you counter that is by compassion and care. I think that's certainly the message of the church. I think whenever
at least it should be.
Yes. So I always have to add, a little subtext there and say when it's at its best, because the church is often not at its best. Christians are often not at their best, and they're often more interested in self-service than anything else. But I think whenever we're actually following the teachings of Jesus, that's kind of the core of his message, is that whenever we are practicing compassion and care, we're combating the horrors of the world. And so earlier, when I was asking about the dream of the kingdom of God, that's one of the things that I had in mind, is that, I don't think the kingdom of God, when Jesus was talking about the kingdom of God, I don't think he was talking about something outside of this world.
Absolutely not.
I think he was talking about a dream for this world and the here and now. That's the thrust of Jesus's message.
And then it just hit me that you set me up with a softball question and I missed it. Dang it. I mean, thank you, but dumb me.
Well, I love it because I love the direction you taught it. Because that's what I love about this podcast, Mark, is that is that I thought you were going to go one way. You went a completely different way. That was 100% right, and and the idea of seeing something beyond us as a dream is something that people can definitely get behind. But I like this idea.
I love where you went with it though, because that is perfect and very true. Like it's about as theological as it gets. It's one of the main points of the things that Jesus was trying to tell us about, is that there is this concept of heaven here on earth, and it's this perfect dream, and it can happen, and it can be here and now. I mean, I love that you went there with it.
Yeah. If enough people believe it, right? And so maybe that's why I saw this as the thesis of the show, is because if enough, maybe this is the Christian theologian in me speaking, right? That if enough people believe it, if enough people get behind it, then we can create it. And I think that was the message of Jesus, that you've got this horror and despair, and the way that you confront that is getting enough people to dream the same dream of peace and justice and compassion and care. So I love that question, Mark. I think you're right. And I've got a question for you as well.
All right, I'll see what I can do.
So I want to know what you think about this. This is another theological question that was raised by the show for me. So you've already told us that no, we don't need a God, but yes, you think it's true that there is something beyond us. And so in this season, we do spend some time in hell. We get to take a voyage through hell. We even find out that hell was maybe colder than we had invented. And so here's my question.
Yeah.
Do we need, we may not need God. Do we need hell? Is hell something that is important? Is that important to like human behavior? What do you think about the concept of hell and how that works?
I think the concept of hell has been read into the Bible, of course, and that it's what we have extrapolated from Dante is not particularly helpful in any way whatsoever. But I do think it's great as a metaphor. The root of the English word hell actually comes from a word that means divided off from or walled off from. And I think that as a concept is beautiful, because if you think of God as love or hope or compassion or any of that kind of thing, then when we find ourselves walled off from or divided away from those things, it is sort of a living hell. I mean, if we think about the times that are the hardest in our life, is when we feel like those things are hard to grab hold of and hard to reach and hard to participate in. And so I think it's a helpful concept, much like your heaven on earth point, when we understand hell to be something that can be a reality for life and not necessarily the afterlife. And that reality is being walled off from the things that are life-giving, hope and love and compassion.
I love that thought, Mark, and the thought that, if we take the otherworldliness out of our tradition, the way that Christianity typically understands things, and we understand heaven as being a possibility here and hell as being something that is a possibility here on earth, and that people may be living in one or the other or both, that's powerful for the way that we think about life. That it's not about maybe making some kind of a confession in the here and now to guarantee your soul's going one place or another, but instead it's about the way we live our lives and whether or not we're creating a heaven or a hell. Well, gee, that changes the way we live our lives, doesn't it? And
it absolutely does.
And it's good theology to think about.
It's really good theology, and I think that might be the perfect place to leave this discussion. I absolutely love that point. And so let's make sure that people know next episode next week, same time, and right here, wherever you're watching, you can watch us here again. But what will we be covering, Caleb? What are we going to be looking at next week? We've been giving a lot of notice on this one. Weeks of
I know,
notice.
because there are three seasons on this show, and I don't know about others out there, but I'm relatively new to this show, and I just fell in love with the show, The Boys. Oh, I just became obsessed with it because it's about superheroes and their powers and what happens if they don't use those powers responsibly. And I was like, wow,
and that's almost
what does happen?
What if they create hell on earth rather than heaven?
That's right. And so watch it. It's on Amazon Prime. Three seasons, about eight episodes a season.
It is challenging to watch at times, and I'm just
a little graphic.
Quite graphic. That was kind of where I was going. It can get very graphic.
Here's what you said last time, Mark. You said it is not for the faint at heart, and I think that's true. It is not, but it's a lot of fun to watch. And a great
but our show is for the faint at heart and those not at faint in heart, and we're glad that everyone who is here has joined us and stuck with us to the end. Thanks to all of you who have been listening to the podcast. We very much appreciate it. Make sure that you have that on whatever source you use as a consistent download. Check us out on Facebook. We appreciate your time here. Caleb, cheers. Here's to another great show, and I appreciated all your insights, sir. We will catch all of you the next time on the Moonshine Jesus Show.
Moonshine